was, you know, an outsider kid, even though I was one of 4 kids growing up. And then later my parents and my mother had 3 more children with my stepdad. I was still a loner. I was drawn to the darker stuff. I was reading, you know, scary stories. I was watching Twilight Zone when it debuted in 1959 when I was 7 years old. And, you know, I just was always, I identified with more with the monsters than with the heroes. You know, all of the television that I watched as a kid, all of the old classic Universal monster movies, the Frankensteins, the Draculas, the Wolfman, and the Roger Corman Poe movies when I started going to movie theaters as a pubescent young man. And you know, all of those things just really had an effect on me. And the stuff that was on TV when I was a kid were, you know, really junky 1950s horror movies like the Four Skulls of Jonathan Drake, something I'm sure you've never heard of, and things of that ilk that were independent and cheap for the local LA TV stations to acquire.
Then when did you decide that filmmaking or, you know, writing, directing, when did you decide that that was the career path you wanted to go down?
You know, I've been naive about it my whole life. I started writing seriously at the age of 12. I was writing short stories. All of them were spooky stories. They had O. Henry type twist endings and the like. I never imagined that a kid from a working class kid from Southern California outside of San Diego, not Los Angeles, would be able to make a living doing such a thing. The more I wrote, as I grew up, you know, I thought I was going to be a rock star. I was a singer in a prog rock band. We wrote and performed our own music, but I loved movies more than anything. And I tried my hand at writing screenplays. And after writing several, I really loved the format, and I loved movies and television. And I grew up as a media kid, as well as reading and writing fiction and the words on a page rather than just on a screenplay. It didn't happen until I was in my 30s. So I was 33 when I got my first paying job as a screenwriter on Amazing Stories, and that kind of changed everything. Suddenly, King Steven Spielberg knighted me, and all those people who wouldn't touch any of my spec scripts before were offering me jobs without even reading any scripts, because I was okay with Steven, then I was okay for them too.
Then your first major film that you got to direct was Critters 2, The Main Course.
I don't know if I'd call it a major film, but yes, your premise is correct.
A major film.
Well, it was amazing. The reason I got it was because I started writing for Steven Spielberg on Amazing Stories. The original Critters was very Spielbergian. And when they wanted to do a sequel, I think Bob Shea, the head of New Line Cinema, his thinking was he could get a writer and director for the same price, and a guy who was learning under Steven Spielberg, writing and directing on Amazing Stories, and that maybe some of that Spielberg stardust would rub off on Critters 2. And everything that's difficult about making movies, kids, animals, special effects, outdoor shooting, elaborate stuff, everything difficult about making a movie was in Critters 2. And so, but not only is it everything difficult about making a movie, but it's in a very low budget movie. And so that was baptism by fire. I said yes, and there was no way I was going to learn better than that.
I noticed a Bates Motel sign just off corner there above your head.
Yes.
You worked on Psycho 4: The Beginning. And when working on that movie, was it at all intimidating, you know, making a sequel / prequel to a film by Alfred Hitchcock? And then I also have to ask, what was it like getting to work with the late Anthony Perkins?
Well, that was the most intimidating part, because Perkins wanted to direct Psycho 4 himself. He had directed Psycho 3, which was not well received, nor was it successful. And so the studio was hiring the director of Critters 2. And so this is an actor who'd worked with Hitchcock and knew the Psycho story and characters better than anybody did. He'd worked with William Wyler and Orson Welles and all of these great filmmakers. And it was made for Showtime, Psycho 4: The Beginning was. And I felt enough removed from the original, and there'd been a successful sequel and an unsuccessful sequel, that I would do it. And it was Showtime, which was way, way lower on the visibility scale than HBO was at that time. So I thought, if it turns out well, people will respond wildly. If it turns out poorly, no one will notice. But the script was written by the screenwriter Joe Stefano, who'd written the original Psycho. So there was a safety net there. My producer had been Hitchcock's first assistant director on the original Psycho. So I felt protected. He tested me a lot, but at the end, he ended up loving the sequel and saying, when we showed it to him at the Hitchcock Theater at Universal, just him and me in a giant screening room at Universal Studios. And he went on for 10 minutes about how great he thought it was and how he felt it was the best of the sequels.
And then, obviously, 2 years after Psycho 4, you come to your first big collaboration with Stephen King, that being Sleepwalkers. How did you get involved with that? Because Sleepwalkers isn't based on any novel. That's an original story by Stephen King. And
Right.
then kind of, what was it like working with Stephen King, and how that relationship between you two kind of blossomed?
It was a major turning point in my career. You know, the Spielberg stuff was very family oriented, and I was getting offered things like Hocus Pocus to write and things like that. So the King thing, basically, Steve had director approval. And there were two directors that Columbia was interested in hiring. And so I had a meeting with them and gave them my pitch and how I would do it. And it was a great meeting. And they said, "We're sure you've got the job, but we have to interview this other director because his agent is somebody we're in business with, and out of respect for them." Then they went and hired the other director. So it was being developed, and I forgot about the project, but the other director started rewriting Stephen King. You can't call a movie Stephen King's Sleepwalkers if he doesn't approve of the script that he wrote and is being changed by this other director. So they ended up firing the other director and hiring me after all. So we had a great working relationship during pre-production by phone. And I never met him until we shot the cameo scene with him and Tobe Hooper and Clive Barker together. And we were only together then for 2 hours. But when the film was finished and I took it to New York, to a screening room in New York to show it to him, he just loved it. It's just me and Steve and his wife Tabby in this tiny little screening room called Magno in Manhattan. And he's laughing and whooping it up and screaming and yelling and had the greatest time. And so that worked out great. The movie came out and was very successful. It was the #1 movie the week it was released. When they were going to do The Stand, he contacted me and said, I would love for you to do this. If Brian De Palma says no, would you do it? Apparently, Brian De Palma said no. And we did it, and it became the highest rated miniseries in history. So, it's 6 hours without all the news breaks and commercials and all that stuff. But it was torturous. There were 126 speaking roles. We shot in 6 states. It was 100 shooting days, and it just went on and on and on. It was the ever ready rabbit of miniseries.
I'm sure you have to talk about it all the time around this time of year, so I only have a few questions about it, but I would be remiss if we did not talk about Hocus Pocus.
What's that?
Yeah, it's this little film. It's this little independent film I think you worked on.
It's that Halloween thing. I remember.
Yeah, not too many. It's kind of like a little cult classic. Nothing.
Yeah, cult. Yeah. Well, I was working on Amazing Stories, and the producer, David Kirshner, who had the idea, it was a story he told his little girls at bedtime that he'd come up with, and he wrote it down for Muppet Magazine, and they published it as a short story. But David knew of me because of my work on Amazing Stories, and I knew of him because he was producing An American Tale for Spielberg's Amblin. So we hit it off great as a friendship and as a creative partnership. And so I was the first writer to come on and write the screenplay from his idea. So we both were credited for the story. And then I was the first writer. And then they brought in 11 other writers after me. And then they ended up going back to primarily my script, but made it a little older. I wrote about 12-year-olds and the movie's about 16-year-olds. And I was thrilled because with Bette Midler at the peak of her career, starring in a movie that I wrote and I was getting first credit for, was amazing. And then it came out and tanked. You know, it did okay, but the reviews were terrible. The box office was bad. And so you learn to just do your best work, hope the marketing and advertising and publicity people do their best work and are successful at it, and then keep moving like a shark. If you stop, you die. But that's what started happening with Hocus Pocus. And I'd start seeing kids wearing Hocus Pocus, Sanderson sisters costumes on Halloween. And then Freeform is showing it every night in October, for 31 days of October, every single day. And suddenly it's like a phenomenon. And I wrote it. And it's like, I'm not used to things being hugely successful that I'm attached to. I expect the worst. And if something good happens, great. But I've been lucky enough to be responsible, at least in part, for some things that maybe were before their time. You know, Hocus Pocus went on to be much more successful on home screens than it was in the theaters, even though just this week they released it again theatrically for its 30th anniversary. 30 years later, and it's more popular than ever by far. When it comes to recommending horror films, what is always kind of your go-to recommendation for people? Well, it kind of changes. Like I said, constantly evolving. You know, one of my favorites is David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers that a lot of people have not seen. It's really dark, but really beautiful and really intelligent. Most recently, I love Talk to Me. The Australian brothers, the Filippo twin brothers who made it, wrote and directed it, they've been on the show, the podcast, and they're just these bros, these dudes, these really wildly enthusiastic, seem like fanboy type guys. But the movie is unbelievably sophisticated and smart and scary as hell. So that's one, if you didn't see it in the theater, I think it's just become available now at home. And I love that movie. And that would be Mick's pick to click this week. Yeah.